So I'm going to go off the stage, and I'm going to invite Chris, who is also known as the Retronaut. If you haven't seen his stuff up online, you should. Look for the Retronaut, some brilliant stuff. But he's going to be showing you, he's like a historian of the future, I think, is the term that I think is what I want to use for you. Is that all right? It's fine. I'll pass you over to Chris Wilde.
Thank you.
Thank you.
A few years ago, I was walking down Oxford High Street, which, did you know, is meant to be the most beautiful high street in Britain, apparently. Clearly, whoever said that had spent very little time in Watford. But anyway, it's meant to be the most beautiful high street in Britain. And there I was walking down the high street and looking around me, and I thought, I was looking at the shop facias and the traffic and the road signs, and I thought, I'm sure this used to be more beautiful. I'm sure it's less beautiful than it used to be. And I was working in museums and archives at this time, and I went back and looked at some of the historic pictures that I had of Oxford. And I thought it did. It definitely, aesthetically, was more attractive. In the 18th century, it certainly was. In fact, for most of the 20th century, in my view, it was. And a strange thought occurred to me, which was that there was no way for me to say that without sounding very reactionary and very conservative, either with a small c or a capital C, as if I was saying, of course, this all used to be a lot more attractive in the old days, when I was a young man and my wife was cleaning my boots and so on. And I thought, well, that's crazy, because I clean my own boots, and I'm not saying that the world is not better. I'm just saying in this specific instance, it's aesthetically less attractive. And as I thought more and more about this, it seemed to me that we had a block. As society, we had a block about looking back. And actually, it's there in the word back. So I thought about this, and I think the way that we think of time is flawed, it's wrong. And I think we have to come up with a new model, because unless we do, we can't articulate the sort of things that I wanted to articulate. We can't... well, let me explain what I mean. So I think most of us imagine time rather like one of those moving pavements at an airport or at Waterloo Station. You actually don't walk, or sometimes you do. But the thing is moving, and it moves you along. And I always enjoy, by the way, I was on one of these recently, and I always enjoy it when someone sort of, you can see they're saying, I'm not going on the walking one, I don't even need to, and I'm just going to speed along, and then you sort of glide past them like that. I really enjoy that. But anyway, completely beside the point. So we're standing on this moving pavement, and this moving pavement is time, and we're standing in the present. I think this is how most of us visualize time, so you may be an exception to this, but this is my theory. And the future is in front of us. That's where we locate the future. The future is there, and the past is behind us. And we're being transported through the present and into the future, and that's where our attention is, that's where we're looking, and we leave this sort of trail behind us, and that's the past. And it's quite difficult for us to look back, because to look back involves us looking over our shoulder. And when we're doing that, we're not looking forward, we're not being progressive. We're not looking at where we're going, where the action is. And we actually, almost socially, prohibit looking back. We have the story of Lot's wife. When she looked back, she got turned into a pillar of salt, which someone said to me would have made for very awkward dinner conversations with Lot and his children later when they were having a meal. And they had to pass the salt. And anyway, again, beside the point. So, but we don't look, never look back. Je ne regrette rien. Regrets I have a few, but not enough to mention. The past is there. It's got the word past. It implies a deadness. It's behind us, and out there is the future, and that's where we're going. And I don't know if you often see this in politics, that manifestos will paint a picture of a future that we're going into. So the last Labour manifesto. The cover was a family looking over some sort of descending hills and a sunset going down, and that's where the future was, and it was a brighter future, fair for all. And the past is something that we shouldn't be paying. We can look back, yeah, it's kind of useful, and history teaches us lessons, etc., but our main focus should be on the future, and the past becomes something slightly sinister almost, sepia, dusty. We sort of feel it dragging us back, and at its best we talk about it as nostalgia and rose-tinted spectacles. Anyway, I decided, I was walking down Oxford High Street, I thought, I think that's wrong. I'm going to get rid of this model of time. And what could be a different model of time? And here's why I thought there needed to be a different model of time, apart from the Oxford High Street thing. I thought about my own life. And there have been various times when I'm particularly happy in my life at the moment, but there have been various times when I've been unhappy. And I would have talked to friends at that time, and they would have said, well, when was the time that you were especially happy? And I would probably have said, well, when I was 18, I was doing an A-levels I really enjoyed, and I had some really good friends, I had my first girlfriend, etc. But they wouldn't then have said, well, there you are, go back to that college, do those A-levels again, find the girl, and wear shorts and get your ears pierced. They would have said, what was it about that time that was giving you that experience of happiness? How do you draw those qualities into your life now? You don't literally have to go back to it, but how do you draw those qualities? In other words, that version of me is contained within me. It's not over and done with or dead, and it's not where the action is. It's part of my own self, and I inhabit all of that in one go. I'm all of those parts of me, and at any one time I can express different aspects of myself. And I thought, well, I think that's a much healthier way of thinking of time. If we could look at the past not as something that was all right. I mean, I think we tend to think of this moment of now as the best moment of now that there's been so far. This is the apotheosis of humanity. What was everybody doing in the past? They could have just invented iPhones, and what were they, not bothering? And we tend to have almost like a prejudice against the past. And I thought, well, there are some ways in which knowledge is progressive, but somebody said to me, nobody ever lived in the past. They only ever lived in now, but it was a different version of now. And I thought, well, I think that's true. I thought, because I've lived in the past, as have you, unless you're incredibly, a nanosecond old. You've lived in the past, I've lived in the past. 10 years, I was alive in the 1970s. To my son, that's incredible that anybody could be that old. And he would say, you were alive in the 70s. What was it? What did it feel like to be alive in the 70s? Unbelievable. To which I'd say, well, my hair was shorter or longer, and I was thinner or fatter, etc., but it kind of felt the same. The experience of existing, of being alive, was a constant. It felt like now. There's a different version of now, but it felt like now. So I figured that the way that we think of time, that linear way, is actually mainly because that's the way we walk, and our eyes are at the front. So I start here, and I very rarely then travel around backwards. Where I'm going is normally in front of me, because that's how we walk. So there's the future, and then I walk into the future, and then over there is the past. But of course, those two spots are relative, because when I'm over here, that's there, and when I get over to there, the moment I'm there, it's here. And the same applies to time. Even I can't follow that. Yeah. So I thought, all right, well, if we didn't have this linear model, what would be another model that we could have? And it's what I call radial time. Imagine the sun. Imagine you are the sun, and you're switched on. So you're not the sun, and then suddenly you're the sun, and you emit light. You radiate light. And the first light comes out of you and radiates out in all directions at once. And then some more light, infinitesimally later, comes out. Well, the first light is the furthest away. And the more recent light is nearer to you. So I thought, well, that could work. What about if time is a container in which we do things, what if we could look out, not look back, but look out in a timescape, like a landscape of all the things that we've done so far? So it's not so much people who have gone they're behind us, they're before us, like being in a queue for a fairground ride. Those people got on the fairground ride first. In other words, time becomes not the attic in which the past becomes not the attic in which we store all the things we don't really have a use for, but it becomes a series of draft versions of the world, draft versions of us. A bit like your wardrobe. When you look in your wardrobe, my wife says I should hire my clothes because as soon as, like a week after I bought them, I'm wearing something different. We look in our wardrobe. We don't only, unless you're me, you don't only wear the clothes you've just bought. You re-curate it, you remix it. You think, well, I'm going to combine that with that and add so and so. And maybe the past is like that. Maybe the past is like an endless series of draft versions of being alive that we can remix, like a DJ's desk, and re-curate. So we can say, well, I definitely don't want to return to the politics of the 1920s and 30s, but Oxford High Street, I actually want to somehow get rid of some of this visual clutter that's around, but I still want cars rather than horses. So we end up remixing it. We say, well, okay, I'm really glad about so many things in society today, and I don't like the fact that it's harder to see the stars at night, so I want to actually take that bit of draft and incorporate it. Anyway, so this is what I was thinking on Oxford High Street. No doubt I would have had even more profound thoughts on Watford High Street, but that was where I was. And I thought, okay, this is very nice and interesting up to a point, but what do I do? Do I walk around with a sandwich board saying, radio time is where it's at, everybody change your view of time? And I thought, well, that's relatively impractical. But I had started to collect pictures, because I was working in museums and archives, pictures that, for me, dissolved away the time. And they work like this, and I'll show you some of them. We all have a map of time, in the same way that we all have a map communally of London. We've all got a version of London in our heads, and you'll have places in London that I don't have, and vice versa. But there are some landmarks that we say, yes, Big Ben, Buckingham Palace, and so on and so forth. That's our communal map of London. Or we have a communal map of time. And so there are things that you see in the past that you pay attention to, and things that I see that I pay attention to. But there are common features. So we see, and the most common one, we tend to see the past in black and white, because that's the majority of photographs of the past are in black and white. And so we tend to think of the past in that way. We tend to see the Victorians as stiff and stilted and in sepia and serious. In other words, beginning with S, and that's our communal map of the Victorians. We would tend to see World War I, or rather, we tend not to see it in colour. We don't tend to think of World War I in colour. When we imagine it in a certain way. And I realised that this map, and the way that we see it, the features that it has, is based not on the reality of that time, but on the prevailing technique of capturing it. In other words, most pictures were taken in black and white, so we think of the past in black and white. And I thought, it's really obvious when you think about it, but it's the sort of thing that I do mull over. If nobody lived in the past, they only lived in now, and it felt the same, and it was just as high resolution and high definition and fully sensory and photographic as any other moment in time. And the anomaly between that reality and our own perception of the past, I was able to exploit. I was able to find pictures that picture A would show me the past and picture B would show me not the past. It would show me a different version of now. I'll show you what I mean.
Get this temperamental. Apologies, people, I'm not here. Please ignore me. There we go.
Cool.
Here, sir.
And I started to showcase this on my site, Retronaut. So here's a picture of the past. This is Trafalgar Square in 1928. That's the Strand. And we look at that and say, yes, that's a picture of the past. Quite interesting, mildly, especially if you're interested in buses, but not generally. But this is a doctored picture. It's actually a colour photograph, original colour, not colourised, actual colour picture that I've taken the colour out of. The screen will amplify the colours a little bit too much, but here's the original colour picture. taken in 1928. And when I saw, it's an autochrome, which was one of the first colour processes. When I saw a picture like that, it was as though the colour dissolved away the tarnish of time on my ring. And I was no longer looking at the past. I was looking, it looked like now, but it was a different version of now. Here's another one that I showed. I started this site, and my mother and I were the two viewers of it. I received a lot of satisfaction from showing them, but there we were. And I showed this picture and three others that went with it. It's actually of much higher resolution than it looks here, but it's 1949, Piccadilly Circus. And my mother and I, between us, would amass around 200 page views a day. And on this particular day, Friday, January the 28th or 29th, 2010, we had 30,000 hits. And I thought, my mother is really putting in the time. You know, I was really impressed. But it had gone viral. And the reason it went viral was because of that anomaly. People would look at it and think, that's a cool picture of, oh, is that Piccadilly Circus? And then they would think, that must be a film set then. Because their subconscious is saying, it's a colour picture, it looks digital, neither of those things existed in 1949. And then they would look closely and say, it can't be a film set, that's far too detailed. And there'd be a little pause, and then they'd go, well, I guess they did have colour pictures in 1949, who knew? And then they would share it, and that's why it went viral. But that little pause, the way I describe it, it's tearing a little hole in someone's map of time, enlarging their map very slightly. And that's all Retronaut is, that's what it does. I choose pictures that I think, for most people, are going to tear a hole in their map of time. Because rather than saying, oh yeah, and by the way, it's all about this radial time thing, I think, well, I'll just show the pictures, and we'll see what happens with that. Here's some Victorians smiling. I did a couple of series on Victorians smiling, and the majority of Victorian pictures were very expensive to take, and they were only taken if you were either dead, lots of photographs of dead people, or if it was a special occasion. It was rather like having your portrait painted. You wouldn't have a casual portrait painted unless you're on the street. So it was expensive. The exposure time was very long as well, which meant that you couldn't really clown around or smile because you would blur the picture. But in the 1890s, the technology changed from the wet plate process to the dry plate process. And in the wet plate process, the photographer had to laboriously paint with this silver solution on the plate, and then before it dried. And with the dry one, he could just take one out, load it in, click. So you get this nice little crossover moment when it still very much looks like Victorians, but you're starting to capture these spontaneous pictures. The cool thing about this picture, from an internet viral point of view, is it even has a cat on the guy's shoulder. Oh yes, this is one of my favorites, and I'll tell you a story about this. So that picture looks very unsinister, the smiling ones, and this one looks really sinister, and you think, well, this is very Victorian. There's a woman under that cloth holding the child on her knee. It's actually not sinister at all, but we just don't normally see these pictures. Because prior to the dry plate, the wet plate process was expensive, and children would wriggle around, so they would have usually the mother, sometimes a servant or a nurse would sit under a cloth and hold the child still, and then later on the photographer would smooth out that pit. I found I had one of these in my family, actually. This is one of my ancestors, and I hadn't known, before I called this one the hidden mother, those pictures before. Before I'd seen that, I'd looked at this picture a number of times. It was taken in the 1860s. But I realized, sorry, I'm going the wrong way. No, we'll come back to that. Okay, I found another picture with the same cloth in the same photo session over a table. It was actually a tablecloth. But it obviously wasn't particularly effective, as you can see by my ancestor's expression. Now, my wife asked me to recreate this. With our own children, which I did. There we go. So that's me. But that's not the most curious thing about this picture. The most curious thing about this picture is my son. I'll show you a few other pictures that I've shown on Retronaut. This is the construction of Disneyland Castle. This is an artificial hand from the 1880s. This is a bear hunting set of armor. Also Victorian, from Russia, from Siberia. Two brilliant comments I got about this on the site. One was, what's the point of it? Because you're hunting this really cross bear that doesn't want to be hunted, and you're wearing Velcro. So now you're running around with this really angry, injured bear stuck to you. My favorite comment, though, was in quotation, "Honey, I'm home." That's Nancy Reagan sitting on Mr. T's lap, kissing his head. This is a late 19th century deep-sea diving apparatus in Paris. It's the Beatles about to cross Abbey Road. It's the first ever car advert. And I'll leave you with this one. On Retronaut, I curate is slightly too grand a word, but I curate time capsules of images from particular times. And I used to do one a day, and I now do 3 a day. Sometimes I've done 6. It's mainly just me. People submit them. But there came a day, and I hadn't done my capsule for the day. And this is a sort of familiar refrain in our house. I haven't done my capsule. I've got to do my capsule. And this guy had sent me some pictures, and this was one of them, and they were, he said, "Hi Chris, in the summer of 1990 I went around the shopping malls in North America taking pictures, don't know if they're any use to you." And I thought, not, all right, maybe. But I was in a rush, and I felt I wasn't doing enough to be supportive in the house. I had to get this capsule done, so I thought, well, all right, we use the shopping mall pictures, and I put them in. And it turned out to be one of the most successful capsules I ever showed. As a footnote to it, the guy, he's now got a publishing deal for the book of the pictures through it. And this is just one of the pictures. They're all like this. And he emailed me, because I hadn't told him I was going to do it, partly because I'd left it to the last minute, and partly because sometimes it's a nice surprise. People like their stuff generally on Retronaut, and so when they see it, they thought, oh, great. And he said the first he knew about it was when the people in the pictures emailed him to say it was them, because I put his email address, and people would say, "Yeah, that's me," and that, when I'm. And this was where the interesting bit was, and it leaves me with a thought about the future of the past, as it were. People said this was their reactions. One was, "Wow, no one's fat." Another was, "Look at all those people smoking in shopping malls." But the main thing they said, and this was the powerful bit for me, this is what I was hoping to create, they said, how could I ever have dressed like that? And they look at it and they said, but 1990, that's now. That's not the past, that's now. And they would look at it and they would think, I was convinced I looked amazing. With that hair. I knew I looked fantastic. But I look at it now, which is still now, and I look terrible. And then they would think, what must I look like now? I kind of think of myself, they would say, as I say, as we all say, we think of ourselves as the definitive version of ourselves. But we're actually just a remix that we are the DJ of, and we're continually remixing. And that can be a frightening thought, that we're in flux. I'll leave you with this. In the 1690s, a student who was 19 called Johannes coined the word nostalgia in his dissertation. And he coined it because he was researching some Swiss soldiers, mercenaries, fighting in Holland, who were very ill and had headaches, they couldn't fight, and he theorized that they had nostalgia, a pathological longing to go home. And that this was causing, because some of them actually died. And from that point onwards into the 1800s, nostalgia was thought of as a pathology, as an illness that you could get. People looked for the nostalgia bone in your head. And this faded away in the 1800s. And then the first use of nostalgia to mean time, because up to that point it just meant home. People theorized that the the cowbells of the Swiss cows had driven the soldiers mad. The reality was they had a really, really horrendous commanding officer, but the Johannes ignored that. Anyway, in the book The White Serpent by D.H. Lawrence, which I think was 1922, that's the first use of nostalgia to mean longing for a time that's gone. In other words, prior to that, nostalgia meant a longing for a home that was geographically located. And then after the First World War, and after the introduction of the car and the motor engine, that shift meant that time gradually began to be the location of home. And it was a time you could never return to, and not a place. Now that interested me because it showed me that the way we think about time can shift. Up until the digital camera and the internet, the recorded version that we have of the past, photographically, started in 1828, and there isn't very much of it, and then there's more of it, and it's black and white, and etc. And it's quite shaky. And I've been able to capitalize on that by saying, oh, look, here's a picture that doesn't fit. I'll use that for a viral hit. But after that point, we suddenly have this almost immaculate block of content going forward. And that will change the way that we think of what the present is and what time is. The internet collapses time. And the anomaly will not be that data, that content. The anomaly will be this period where we saw history as having that progressive path. Because prior to that, there was almost no recorded data. There certainly wasn't any photographic data. And no photographic data is much more similar than total photographic data than that mid-period. So the way that I believe, the way that we think of time now, the way that we think of history, and that history recedes into a shaky, nebulous, sepia-tinged field, I think that's the anomaly. And I think that we will return to a point when the present and now doesn't change. Thank you.
Chris, thank you very much. So, do you think with technology and the way that photography is, we're able to see things sort of well with digital technology, but is it not going to take another leap potentially, so that we start to get the 3D stuff? And I know they've got cameras now that you can see around corners. Will that affect it much? When we start to get something that's far more about experiencing a real-world event and being able to look around things, will we start to look at this digital stuff we've got now and go, actually, that's a bit shit in comparison? This was all just part of the journey that takes us towards this 3D environment.
No, I don't think so, because I think the experience of being alive and actually existing in a three-dimensional universe in the present moment, everything else is an inferior version of that. And so, for example, when you see historic programs which recreate buildings and sort of rebuild them, it's pretty cool, but it doesn't profoundly change the way that you see the past.
Mm-hmm. That's great, Chris. Thank you very much indeed.
Thanks, Dave.